Okay, all good to go.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you are all safe and well in this difficult time. Thank you for joining us for our Gender and Climate Change event. My name is Safa Lukili. I'm the events director of the Oxford Climate Society, and I'm a master student of environmental management at Oxford. Our society is a part of Oxford University. We aim to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our School of Climate Change. We also run the world's largest student-led climate journal, The Anthroposphere, and we are working with the university to incorporate climate in the Oxford curriculum. The theme of today's event is very important. It's the gender differentiated effects of climate change and the way gender inequality impacts gender adaptation and mitigation efforts. Climate change disproportionately affects women. As primary energy, water, and food providers and managers for their households, women are the first to feel the stress of water scarcity, of desertification, of biodiversity loss. To give some examples, they are the ones who are forced to travel longer distances to gather biomass fuels or to harvest water, exposing themselves to harassment, sexual assault, or even rape. Women are also 14 times more likely to die during a natural disaster. And while fighting all these challenges and adapting to a changing climate, women are faced with many obstacles resulting from discriminatory legislation or traditional social norms, or both. These include unequal rights to land or poor representation at decision-making levels in key sectors such as water allocation or energy provision, for example. But the links between gender and climate change do not stop here. The gender inequality, as some studies have shown, hinders our ability to adapt to the changing climate. And so today, a number of questions will be addressed. To what extent are the consequences of ongoing environmental change gender differentiated? How could reducing gender inequality affect our climate response? And most importantly, how can we position women and men as equal agents of change in our sustainable development strategies? So to discuss these essential questions, I am delighted to welcome Professor Johnny Ziga and Lorena Aguilar. Professor Ziga is a feminist geographer and professor of global studies at Bentley University in Boston, USA. She is the author of many books on gender equity and global environmental policy, including her award-winning The Women Atlas, which I suggest you go to the library and borrow. She has been an active consultant with the UN on several gender and environmental policy projects. And Lorena Aguilar is the regional coordinator of international cooperation and research at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. She previously served as Costa Rica's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and Worship. And for many years, Lorena also worked at the International Union for Conservation of Nature as their global senior gender advisor. And so we're going to start this event with each of the speakers giving a short speech with their thoughts on the topic. And then that will be followed from questions from myself and then from questions from you, the audience. And so if you have any, please write them in the live stream on YouTube and we will address them. So thank you so much, Johnny and Lorena, for joining us today. And so if we can start with Johnny, yeah, I'll hand the floor to you.
Let me unmute. A habit that we all are still struggling with. I know I start almost every Zoom meeting, someone saying, unmute or you're muted to me or to others. But anyway, we'll get there. So thank you very much, Safa. Thank you to the Oxford Climate Society. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for hosting this conversation, and I'm very pleased to be here with a longtime colleague, Lorena. We have crisscrossed over many years, and it's great to be on the same platform again. So let me start my comments by kind of mapping out big picture of gender and climate change. And Safa, you already actually moved us down that path a little bit. The earliest work, and in some ways the most apparent work on gender and climate change, meaning it's actually kind of the easiest to see, literally, sometimes literally, is in fact on impacts, the impact effects and the differential vulnerability of men and women to direct impacts of climate change. So extreme droughts, accelerated storms, accelerated storm events and disaster events. And exactly as you said earlier, Safa, the impacts of that ripple through society along lines of vulnerability. Not only gender, I would say, but of course, other vulnerable groups or groups with less economic or social clout, whether that be by ethnicity or race or class or age or religion. But we're focused today on gender, so I'll restrict my comments to that. And we can actually see these direct impacts turning up in statistics, for example, on deaths and injuries in disasters that are accelerated or indeed caused by climate change. And there's a ton of research on that. Still spotty. I mean, and Lorraine and I've talked about this over many years, that the data patterns are still very uneven, but nonetheless, we have direct evidence of that. And as you said, Safa, there are kind of knock-on social condition effects. That is, if climate change is producing economic hardship or livelihood hardship, it's going to be girls who are pulled out of school first. It's going to be, you'll see, we are already seeing an uptick in girl-child marriages, those sorts of impacts, both direct impacts to biophysical effects and to recover and to effects of disasters, and also recovery from disasters typically have different outcomes for men and for women. And one of the things you can look at even at the most kind of intro level is you can say, where do recovery jobs go to? Well, if it's often considered to be recovery and reconstruction from disaster is often considered to be literally in the construction or the reconstruction of infrastructure. And so there have been a few studies that show that those are mostly male jobs. And that then aggravates and exacerbates the effects that I talked about earlier, that with economic shifts, gender inequalities get hardened. I'd also say that the tendency is in the after effect of geophysical, biophysical disasters or impacts to think of technical solutions. So, buoys in the water or various technical fixes. And that's important. It's important to have a buoy in the water to measure wind speed or impending hurricane, but that's not going to solve the social problems. So we see a tendency to physical reconstruction that favors men's economic position, and a tendency to technical solutions. And that's partly because of the leadership. And I'm almost pretty sure Lorena is going to talk about this, so I won't talk much about it, but that's the leadership of who's at the table, who's defining problems and who's defining solutions. So, okay, so we have a large domain of work and attention to impacts. There's more recently, there's been particular analytical attention to drivers. It's like, okay, fine. What's causing climate change? What are the drivers of climate change? And those drivers are gendered. Now, it often gets very tricky when you say that. Men often freak out because they feel as though they're being, called out for some different, for example, consumer behaviors. If we look at overconsumption in the rich world, and that's often identified as one of the major environmental problems and one of the major drivers of climate change specifically. Well, overconsumption in the rich world is gendered, and it's intentionally gendered. I mean, I have friends who will send me pictures of, I don't know, a box of popcorn that's blue for boys and exactly the same box of popcorn that's pink for girls, side by side at, a movie theater stand, when we all did have movie theaters or go to movie theaters. But the gendering of everything from, shampoo to deodorant to pens to cars actually drives and accelerates overconsumption. And that dynamic is just now starting to be put on the table in climate change discussion. But when we look at the construction of identity between masculinity and big cars, or masculinity and meat eating, both of which as consumer habits have been identified as problems for climate change, we need to actually reflect on how to disentangle identities of masculinity and femininity from consumer production and consumption and production. I would just like to detour a little bit to say that I actually tend to resist looking at individual behaviors as problematic for climate change, because the large structures of production and industry is where I want to put my attention. But if we're going to talk about overconsumption in the rich world, which we must, then we must also look at the gendered nature of that. And there are very significant differences in certainly in most of the post-industrial world in men's and women's attitudes toward and perceptions of climate change and willingness to consider sweeping economic or social changes. I just saw, I'm one of the few people left in the world who subscribes to an actual newspaper in hard form. Just saw in the New York Times a couple of days ago, there was a really interesting series of what voters in various of the American, what they call battleground states, given the current election, what voters in these states think about climate change. And once again, we see huge differences. I mean, really big, on the scale of polling, seismic gaps between men and women about, do you think climate change is a problem? Do you think you're going to be affected? Do you think we should change our economic basis from fossil fuels, transition out from fossil fuels? Do you support, there's one here, do you support or oppose opening up public lands for more oil and gas drilling? Men are much more in favor of that. American men, this is an American poll, than their female counterparts. It's not just in the States. I've seen polls pretty much around the world that show very significant male-female differences in perceptions of climate change and in the palatability of various solutions. So just let me wrap up on that note by saying, as we start collectively moving toward what's called the just transition, transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy, that just transition, as it is currently being formulated, is itself a product of gendered presumptions.
Johnny, you're frozen. Okay.
Let's just give it a minute.
I think it's very interesting what Johnny was saying about the way women and men are perceiving the gender of climate change, the danger of climate change, and how that makes it very important as well to have women in leadership and decision-making policy positions, and so that we can have as well responses that are that take into considerations all the populations, and also take into consideration the whole society, and what's needed to have a balanced and just a response to the crisis. As Johnny has issues with her connection right now. We'll just move to Lorena, and if Johnny wants to add something, she'll add it when she joins us again. So Lorena, please.
Oh, good morning for me, Safa. Good afternoon for everyone. Thank you for the Oxford Society for this invitation. And I will say hi to Joni when I see her later. I'm going to start sharing a brief presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Just a sec. Okay, so where are we when it comes to climate change? Yeah, we all feel that we are toward the edge of the cliff. And it comes, I mean, you can see the data coming from the IPCC global warning, in which if we are at 1 degree, 14% of the world population should be vulnerable to severe and deadly heat waves. But if we go over 2%, the figure jumps up to 37%. And we know that if we go to 2 degrees, the amount of people, of city dwellers worldwide will face more scarcity of water, and that can come up to 411 million of people. And it is the same when we come to the reports of the sea level rise that we're seeing all around the world, up to 80 million people being affected. But how, as Johnny was saying, how does people in the world find themselves in that process is also important. And we as well, as humanity, we have wiped out 60% of mammal, birds, fish, and reptiles between 1970 and 2014. And if I can scale up what we have done using human population, that is equivalent as emptying North America, South America, Africa, Europe, China, and Oceania. That's what the world is facing. Yes, because of climate change, but also because of overexploitation of our biodiversity. So how does this find us? It finds women and men in a different situation, facing tremendous gender gaps. For example, we know that women have only legal right access to own and acquire land in only 28 countries in the world. And even in those countries in which they have those legal rights, this is an example of what you can see on land tenure in the Yucatan Peninsula. Mexico is one of those 28 countries, but even though the laws are there, they cannot have access to these resources. But we're not only victims or suffering the climate change, we're a tremendous force when it comes to change what we have, agents of change. We are the world's third largest emerging market after China and India. For example. And we see this throughout the world, women groups and women organizations and women themselves having a tremendous impact. This is the example of 1 million women. This is a movement in Australia, which have, and I will advise all of you to look at their app. It's fascinating. From any part of the world, you can link, you can make commitments, and only the work that they have done in Australia, they have committed to cut over 100,000 tons of CO2. And if I put that in a reference, that is like taking off 240,000 cars off the road per year, or closing 2 coal mines. That is the impact and the power of some of these efforts worldwide. We also know, and Joni was talking about the green recovery that we're talking right now, that the energy sector, it's an incredible area in which women are already having a higher level of involvement. For example, we have women working in the workforce in renewable energy, 32%, compared to 10%, to 20% or 25% in traditional energy industries. But the energy sector, definitely, with the possibilities that this has, and with the energy and the green transition or the greener of the economy that the world is promoting after COVID-19. It's an area that we should look like for these type of processes. But we also have disasters, as Joni was saying. Just from 1970 to 2010, in 2007, we have 960 major disasters, and at that time, it was the highest figure. The average number of people exposed by year have increasingly, in some cases, 114%. In another cases, to tropical cyclones, 192%. And the data from all the round shows that when there are gender gaps, that means when women do not have access to education, for example, they do not understand the messages. I mean, what are 260 kilometers an hour? You have never driven a bicycle, not a car, it makes no sense. What do you do? It has to do with the lack of participation. They're not invited, they're not taking account when it comes to prevention and management of disorders. And even something like land tenure has an impact, especially for reconstruction. So we know that women have less assets to cope with some of these disasters. And in some cases, the ratio of that we have seen worldwide in those countries that have bigger gender gaps is that for every man that dies, you have 4 women. So talking about investment in climate change, if you just invent in some of those gender gaps, in closing those gender gaps, the ratio of deaths during disasters associated with climate change will decrease significantly. And some of the linkages we're just getting to know. Sometimes things like sea level rise in coastal areas might seem like there's no gender connection to it. But doing work in Bangladesh, we found out that, for example, at the end of the Delta, 30% of the women that were pregnant were having an increase in preeclampsia and eclampsia. This is a disease that happens to pregnant women where you have your blood pressure is one of the characteristics that rises. Despite the fact that everybody was drinking water with salt because of the rise of the sea going into the wells, it had a differentiated impact. So knowing all of this and throughout the years, one of the works that I had been doing is generating that knowledge, because when we started in the early 2000s, there was very little knowledge on these linkages. What are we doing? I mean, within the United Nations Climate Change Convention, the important thing is that it was one of the only 3 sister year conventions, the Biodiversity Convention, the Dryland Conventions, that did not have a mandate. Before 2007, there was not a single reference to gender. And when we tried to work on that convention, they said, take that soft topic somewhere else. This is a scientific convention. This whole thing about human rights and gender is not the place to go. Well, we did not give up. It has been a long process, and today we're very, very happy to say that due to the effort of many women and men, to date, we have more than 7 decisions and references. And of course, as Joni was also saying, adaptation is the theme that has more mandates, and mitigation has less decisions, and still we have to work on that. But an important step forward is that we have been able to achieve that all the financial mechanisms associated with climate change now have gender policies and mandates. So we work on a parallel. I mean, we work on making sure that there were very strong mandates within the conventions, that they also had implications for the finance mechanisms, because that is where the trick is, the implementation of these decisions that the world has done. We have the Paris Agreement. We also fought very strong to have gender equality as a guiding principle. We would have liked to have it as an operational principle, but that's how much we were able to do. There are specific mentions to gender and adaptation, capacity building and technology in the other sections of the Paris Agreement. And I think one of the things that is also very important is how all this process is really having an impact at the national level. And we have 40 of the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, that are the documents that are being produced by the countries to overcome climate change. Mention gender and women, some of them better than others, but there is a mention on that respect. Of course, as I was saying, implementation is the challenge. How to do it? The Lima Work Program under the convention, I will have to say, is the most important decision. There is a clear mandate to the Secretariat to have, for example, a gender focal point, because one of the constraints that we faced every time that we said, well, gender has to be mainstream, the Secretariat will say we don't have a mandate from the parties. So that is the reason that we worked so hard for so many years, generating knowledge, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, gender is an agenda topic at every COP. That is also a great element that we were able to achieve. And of those of you who are interested, look at the two gender action plans under the convention. It took us 20 years to make the first one. So we're very proud to say that there are two, there's still lots of holes in it and things to do. And then just going very fast, I mean, how this is also having an impact at the national level. I'm going to share with you some of the work that I did when I was in IUCN, what we call the CC gaps, the Climate Change Gender Action Plans. And still now at Flaxo, we are supporting various countries to conduct these type of processes. So as I was saying, this has been a long process. We started in 2007 generating knowledge. The first manual on gender and climate change came at that time. We had to build a capacity of more than 12,100 people around the world, decision makers that could bring the topic into the convention. We generate an advocacy strategy. We were able to bring together a group of more than 150 organizations. One of our colleague and good friend, Rebecca Pearl, that is a friend of Joni and a colleague of myself, we were able to convene the largest group to really do advocacy. And then we had Copenhagen, when all of us thought that we were able to gonna have an agreement. That went sour. But then the countries in which we have developed those capacities start saying, we can't wait for an international agreement. So this is the way that for now some years, following a 5-step process, the countries of the world, 26 at the moment and more than 15 more than are requesting it, have been developing these processes. Important is that we're using the right eyes for climate change. All the initiatives under the CC gaps follow these 6 principles. They have to be inclusive. They have to have an impact in the reduction of emissions. They have to improve quality of life. And they have to bring innovation. We cannot continue working gender and climate change only with chickens and pigs and improved stoves. There is a life outside the household in that respect. So these are some of the examples. We have in Egypt, women talking with the ministries of transport about having water taxis in the Nile. Because when you are in Cairo, the problem of contamination and the impossibility to move easily in the city, it's an issue. So a water taxi program in the Nile, in which women manage it. It uses low emissions technology, but it also stops in the areas that are fundamental for some of the women that have to conduct those things. Aviation emission audits. This is something that comes from the Dominican Republic, from the CC Gap, a country that is basically, well, it is an island and its major connection is basically through air. Europe is very strong on emission audits. So the women said, train us as aviation emission audits so that we can keep on. And like that, there are hundreds of examples and the CC gaps. So what is the way forward? Definitely, we have to work more on capacity to develop and implement this know-how. We have 72 mandates. We have enough mandates within the convention. Implementation is the challenge. How do you link gender with RED, with reduction of emissions of deforestation and degradations? How do you do it in these transition to a greener economy? But we also need to look at innovative initiatives. We cannot remain in this area of work and that women, we are barefooted, pregnant, poor, and that have to be looked after. And the ideas and the initiatives have to be beyond that part. And we also have to develop gender responsive policies. This is a terminology that we have been using, especially in the climate change arena. And when we say gender responsive policies, this is recognizing these gender gaps, but doing something to close them. Because for many, many years, the problem has been is that we acknowledge the gender differences. We conduct gender analysis. Oh yes, they work 10 hours, they do this, but what are the policies, programs, and initiatives doing to really close those gender gaps? As I said, finance mechanisms, for the first time, they all have gender mandates, but we need to create the spaces for women and women organizations at the national and subnational level that can have access to those resources, because right now that is not easy. And then to end, we continue working on that. Beijing 25 at the moment is conducting this coalition, the Gender Equality Coalition. We're very proud as Flaxo to be part of the leading group. I mean, as Costa Rica, we're leading the climate change justice track. And we hope that we can find a path to the sustainable future. And just to finalize, no gender neutral intervention exists across the scope of environmental change. Women represent half of the world population, and we are 3.6 solutions to climate change. It would be logical to ignore these powerful resources for sustainable solutions. And with that, thank you very much, Safa.
Thank you so much, Lorena, for this really insightful kind of introduction to what's going on and what women are doing to kind of organize themselves, not only to help themselves, but to really lead the climate initiatives. So as Johnny was cut off earlier, I just had a question about what you were saying about, you know, women's kind of particular sensitivity or awareness about climate change. So often women are seen a bit like, or presented as passive victims of environmental degradation. You see this narrative quite often. But then when we think about it, a lot of the figures that we have in environmental movements, so Rachel Carson's Silent Spring against pesticides, or Wangari Maathai and the Green Belt movement, Vandana Shiva, and I could go on and on. But all of these figures are women, right? So how, without falling into the essentializing discourse about women are closer to understand this because they're closer to nature and fertility and all this, why do you think these trends can be seen? And if you could give us some answers. Yeah.
Is that for me, Joni?
Yes.
Yeah. Why the differences? Sorry, I don't know what happened with the computer there. It just completely died, by the way. But thank you for your question, and I'm glad I caught most of Lorena's presentation. Why these differences? Why these perceptual differences between men and women and about climate change? There have been all kinds of explanations and investigations of this. Some people kind of follow a psychological path that men are socialized to be more reluctant to admit that they might be overcome by forces bigger than them. Men are more confident about technical solutions. Women are more willing to admit vulnerabilities. I mean, there are all kinds of explanations like that. I actually don't I'm not knowledgeable about those kinds of psychological explanations. I would turn to more structural explanations that people who are economically or socially vulnerable see threats to their well-being more readily. So I would put that forward. But I would say that agreeing with you entirely, Safa, that we should completely reject the essentialism of women are this and men are that. And also while acknowledging the contributions, as Lorena has also raised, of women as activists and as voices of change, I still want to keep pulling us back to looking at structures. So for example, I think Lorena mentioned in passing about the breaking the grip that geophysical sciences have on defining what climate change is. Now, I'm a geographer. I've been trained in the physical sciences. Some of my best friends are, geophysicists. But in fact, it really is a two-culture problem that if climate change is considered to be a geophysical problem and experts are therefore geophysicists, they're atmospheric chemists or oceanographers or geologists, we are by definition we're hardening gender inequalities between the sciences and the social sciences. We're excluding women from being part of that conversation. And we're looking at climate change through a very narrow lens. I mean, obviously climate change involves geophysical processes, and we need to understand them, and we need to track them, and we need to develop both adaptation and mitigation strategies for them. But climate change is actually a social problem. And the oceans are not acidifying by themselves. The trees are not getting up in the middle of the night and walking away while we're not looking. I mean, humans are agents of change. And we're either producing institutions, depending on how you want to look at it, that have run amok and are causing these environmental degradations, or we're producing institutions that are running as they were designed to run and are producing these environmental degradations. But if we leave social analysis, if we sideline social analysis, we not only sideline women, meaning embodied participants who are women from this process, but we ignore an entire body of analytical strength.
Yes, I suppose that is all, again, this idea of interdisciplinarity and the need for it. And also we can't just suck carbon out of the atmosphere and think that is it, right? So Lorena, do you have any thought on why women have this perception of climate change?
No, I have to agree with Joni that there are different causes and reasons, and the studies have been sometimes just very initial at the moment to do that. I completely agree with Joni. This is not in our blood. This is not a genetical thing that we have the capacity to hug trees like sometimes it had been put around the world. But the point that Joni was making, when you have less assets, less capital to overcome a given situation, you pay a lot more attention to that. I mean, you really look after it in a different way. And sometimes it's because the proximity of some of these issues, and sometimes it's just basically that. And in other countries, it has been that the women movement have taken the topic of biodiversity and climate change closer. I mean, and you can see it now with the youth movement. I mean, why are the youth really thinking that climate change? Because they are now a group, a movement that have been doing this. And I have to say that women organizations and the women movement more and more and more are bringing climate change under the scope and the processes analysis, something that was not there. I mean, when we started talking about gender and climate change in 2000, and you talk about these things to the women organizations that said, what? No. There's no linkage between these things. The same thing happened with biodiversity, but more and more women from all around the world are building these conscience because you're part of those movements, because you have to rely on those elements. I mean, when you work with indigenous women in some communities in rural areas around the world, the lack or too much of water, for example, is the survival of your family and of your group. So you create a better conscience and a better linkage. So it varies. I mean, we women are not one big pocket that react in the same way. There are different reasons in why we come into this process.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, the idea of intersectionality and the fact that we're not just women and we're not just men. We're a Moroccan young woman that has a certain background. We're different. We have lives and experiences that are personal to us and that kind of also motivate our actions. Just about this idea of women organizing, for example, around the 1 million women movement, or farmer organizations, women organizations that are organized to have microfinance and help each other. So even though we see that climate change kind of disfavors women and it exacerbates some structural issues of inequality, I was wondering whether this had the ability somehow to kind of open a space in the public space and these opportunities for women to grab leadership positions and to really, fight for their rights in a way that's very paradoxical, but yeah.
Lorena, if you want to take that.
Yes, Safa, definitely. I have to agree with you. And I'm just going to use a couple of examples. And it's very close to my heart. Christiana Figueres, the Secretary General of the Climate Change Convention, she was the one that made it possible that we had the Paris Agreement. And it was followed by another women. And in the climate change arena, because it came from the environmental sector, there are certain sectors around the world that had been overlooked, like culture and health and social issues and environment, in which women have taken a lot more of protagonism in some of these ministries. And we saw them during the MDGs, and we saw them during the SDGs, and we are seeing them more and more active in the environmental sector. A research that we did some years ago showcase, for example, that this is not only on the environmental level, but also environmental NGOs as well, and local NGOs, very much driven by women. So women have been finding a voice and a place in the climate change and the environmental, let's say, area as a whole. But also we are seeing them organizing based on these differences. For example, we're seeing women taking the opportunity to be more active on renewables, on the energy, because it was an incipient area in which nobody was paying a lot of attention, and you see them boosting in to have the information that we have right now. I mean, they found that path. So I will say that the environmental sector, I work in the environmental sector for 30 years. It's an incredible sector to empower women, an incredible area in which we have opportunities, because you come to it not only by being a biologist or a physicist or a geographer, but you also come from the sustainability part to the management part in which people are being brought in. So you bring also women from different areas, from social sciences, from education, from a variety of sectors in which we can meet and work together.
Thank you, Lorena. Johnny, do you want to add something to this?
Well, I would just say that, of course, activism in one domain. So if women do find a position to stand socially and kind of find their voice and assert their leadership in the environmental domain, leadership in or activism in that domain will enforce and bolster leadership in other domains. I mean, as women are seen, as we normalize seeing women in positions of authority and as experts and as explainers of what's going on, that kind of raises raises the bar for women to be involved in other activities too. So I think there's a kind of synergistic effect that's, very hard to track and, detail specifically, but it's a general effect that I think we see. And it works the other way as women get more involved in formal political positions or formal organizations that also can accelerate their involvement in environmental organizing and environmental policy making.
But Safa, if you allow me, I think that also this has different levels, because what I have seen working in all the regions of the world is that even in societies in which there are tremendous restrictions for women participation and for women leadership, when you come with an environmental project dealing with forests, landscape restoration, water management, there's less limitations, despite the fact that you might go inside those communities with a very clear gender responsive approach, that what you're going to do is close those gaps and really empower women to exercise a different type of leadership. But I have found that as an important entry point. I have been in very difficult communities in which you are not allowed to talk about gender equality or all of the things. You go with the forestry project and you really see them mobilizing and moving and closing some of those gender gaps. For example, in Cameroon, it was thanks to a RED initiative working on this that is called reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation, that we were able to reform land tenure in Cameroon. So they didn't saw it coming, literally, when we were working on those areas. And the other thing that is also very important is that some of these innovative ideas linked to climate change, since they have never been conducted in a community, you have a very even platform to bring women and men together that doesn't attempt against traditions that sometimes they set, and build new forms of relationships. So if there has never been a geothermal exploitation project in that area, and there is the possibility of using the water and the fumes, and then you bring women and men together to organize, to conduct initiatives. It's incredible. It's incredible how that serves you as a platform for change.
I suppose I know from my own experience in my country that sometimes when we talk about gender equality, or because of the way that kind of feminism has been weaponized in colonized countries, it's often seen as this cultural war. So I suppose when you enter it from the environmental perspective, it's seen as a necessity, right? Something we do because we need to do it, not because somehow it's a Western import. Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and what you said, Safa, is it's really interesting. Once you conduct this process, and people will say in some of these communities that were very much against gender equality, and this is what was about. If I would have known, I would have allowed my women to participate many years ago. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, indeed, very interesting. So I had a question about this as well from on the national level, the government's like kind of attitude towards it, right? So have you seen, not only on the local level, but governments being more likely to implement because as you have said earlier, in most of the countries around the world, the legislation is egalitarian in a way, for example, for land tenure for the majority, but then the implementation makes it so that it's not the case. So have you seen kind of a move from government to take the issue of gender equality more seriously now that it has to do with something that appeals to them?
Yes, and
no.
I will.
Sorry, I jumped in and say no.
Okay,
go ahead, Lorena.
A lot of times is talk. Oh yes, we're promoting gender equality and we're doing those things. But more and more and more, I think one of the more strategic works that we have done was ensuring that gender was part of the financing mechanisms. Now, if they don't incorporate gender, they don't get the money. Of course, implementation is also always a challenge. I mean, because you can put in a project any type of things, and paper is really good to support any of those things. But we are seeing, I mean, and from where we started in 2000, Joni, to where we are at the moment, there are countries, and it depends on the country and it depends on its leaderships, that are really, really trying to make important efforts. And sometimes they go back and take a step back. But for example, the example of Cameroon, it was thanks to a climate change project linked to climate change that embraced the principles of gender equality, that one of the most damaging gender gaps was overcome. That is, was the possibility of women to have access to land. And that opened then a whole bunch of other possibilities: having access to credit because now they own that land, being able to participate because only owners of land could participate in these processes. So I have to say that probably we have not walked as fast as we want to walk, but we see countries that are taking steps in the right direction. Probably I'm more positive that Joni in a lot of things, because I see it in the lives of those women and those men. We are, for example, right now in Costa Rica developing a gender equality seal, in which those productive units that can prove that they're closing gender gaps are going to have access to markets and to new fresh resources. So there are processes happening, and a lot of hope on the youth as well from some of these countries.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree, especially if you look at an arc of 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. I agree that there's been progress. It's slow, it's halting, it's fragile, and it's often used instrumentally when it's convenient. So,
Okay.
I mean, yes, overall, I think I would agree with you, Lorena, that overall, certainly there's been gender equality progress on kind of a grand scale and also on a local scale, but it's very fragile and often not invoked for its own sake. It's used as you said, because it's instrumentally useful to access other resources. So if you have a requirement, I mean, and you and I see this all the time, Lorena, when we work with international organizations. If you have a requirement that the box be ticked to say you've done a gender survey or a gender audit, or you need to have a gender financing line, it will be ticked. That box will be ticked. It's not clear to me that that's always, I don't mean to say that's always cynical or meaningless. I would not say that. I would say it's often quite meaningful, but it's also using gender equality as this kind of on-off switch when it's essential to access other resources. I don't know, perhaps I'm too cynical.
Yeah, well, but I mean, that is also true with other topics, Joni, not only with gender equality. You see it even with complying with green elements, or on human rights, or I mean, you see it even in economical issues. Are you complying with this? And people kind of tick these boxes to get access to it. So I think that yes, I mean, gender can be another element to tick on the box. It wasn't there 20 years ago to tick that box. That ticking of the box have led to some interesting processes. But as in other sectors, we cannot be that hard in the sense. I know we get desesperated. I mean, I don't know if that word even exists in English, but I mean, when I read that it's going to take us 75 more years to achieve equal payment for the work that we do, I mean, it really enraged me. And I said, I mean, how is it possible that at this time in life, we're still fighting for being considered a human being, a capable person. I mean, it really can infuriate you, and that we would like to see things moving faster. But it took how many centuries to build what
Yeah,
we have? So,
I suppose, as you said, it's in other issues as well. For example, diversity is often used as this like token, right? You have one person and you're like, oh well, we achieved. Yes. So I I'm gonna give you one more question from my side, and then we'll move to the audience. So it's predicted that climate change is gonna might exacerbate conflicts or lead to conflicts, or most likely lead to mass displacements. So could you speak on how that might particularly affect women, as we have not touched on this yet? That would be an interesting perspective. Yeah.
Lorena, do you want to start?
well, definitely, Safa, this is something that we're seeing all around the world, and I can talk about Mesoamerica, for example. I mean, the massive migrations that we saw toward the US in the last years, a lot of them come from communities that have been severely affected by climate change, and that have not been seen. But not only the migration from country to country, but also internal migration in some of the countries, people moving from areas where they just cannot plant anymore or grow anymore or live anymore for various effects caused by climate change. Very little has been studied in that respect, and it is going to be, from my point of view, one of the biggest challenges that the world is going to face when it comes to climate change, and it's associated with migration. And there are studies that says that the Syria conflict started precisely from a tremendous drought associated with climate change. So I think more and more when we go in depth analyzing these phenomena, we're going to see more the linkages. The other part is also true. We found out in Central America that those communities that did not, where people did not migrate, a lot of them had initiatives linking women to enhance the lives of their communities. So it's quite interesting when you start seeing these phenomena. And also another area in which has been, I think, a little bit more explored is the impact. I mean, Women in Africa has a very funny saying using the word migration and adaptation, said, "Man migrate, we women adapt." They stay in a lot of these affected and degraded lands and areas. And that has a major impact in their lives, in their health, of their children, and their network of support that they require. So as I said, definitely this is an area that requires more work, but we're seeing more and more and more around the world that migration associated with climate change, for me, is going to be one of the main topics in the next years. Pretty soon, we're already seeing it, but massive ones.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and add to that. I of course think Lorraine is absolutely right on that. There's an expression used often in feminist and are shocked
We're
when
using
households or families are under pressure or facing severe constraints. Women's labor is the absorber um, that protect household. And we're seeing that, I mean, to many people's astonishment, we're seeing that COVID now, that in the United States, for example, the number of women who are leaving the workforce, from, doctors to cafeteria workers, because someone needs to be at home to take care of the children who are not able to be in the school. Women are leaving workforce all over the world for when women are part of the formal workforce, because they need to be the shock absorber of the household. So that the stresses of climate change exacerbate that, and the stresses of migration induced by climate change will only kind of double down on that.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about, women being asked to make sacrifices first for their household and for caring for their children. Yeah, even I was reading that in Bangladesh, when the floods come and they need sustenance, they would sell the lands that the women own before the lands that the men own. It's interesting, this trend that yeah. Thank you so much for your insights. I'll move to the questions from the audience. So one of our members is asking if you found any differences in how climate change affects LGBTQ women in particular. Um, um, is this I suppose LGBTQ community, not women.
Mhm.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and this is what one of the points I made elliptically in my opening remarks, that uh, climate change and disasters and vulnerabilities associated with climate change fracture along vulnerability lines and social power lines existing power axes in society. And so any groups that are vulnerable, that are marginalized, that don't have a place at the table, whose needs are not taken care of, who perhaps need to live with some degree of, in some societies, secrecy or invisibility, will feel the effects more strongly and differently, or I should reverse this and say differently and often more strongly than other groups. So absolutely. Now there's been very little research. There's been some research that I'm aware of around LGBTQ groups and disasters in Southeast Asia. Some interesting research, but there's not a lot of explicit analysis out there that marks those lines of difference.
No, I have to agree with Joni 100%. And I think Fiji, there is a group called Rainbow Group. It's quite interesting, some of the research that they have been doing, in which, for example, during the disasters, members of the LGBTQI community are not even allowed to go into refugee zones because they can transfer their disease to other members of the society. So there is still a lot to do to work on those topics. But any group, as Joni is saying, that express some level of vulnerability, um, climate change will exacerbate those vulnerabilities tremendously. So it's something that we need, and that's where the intersectionality comes. But it's important because a member of LGBTQ community in the US is not the same that one in Guatemala or Fiji. So there is also different levels that we need to understand. It's this intersectionality also that we need to understand.
Thank you. I'm just having a look right now at the questions. So we have another question that's somehow related. So one of the members asking how to transform gender dynamics in contexts where gender roles are very closely tied up with indigenous or customary natural resource management systems.
I'm actually not sure I understand the question. How to transform gender dynamics in indigenous communities? I'm not sure. I'm quite sure what the direction of the question is.
Cultures in which the gender dynamics are pretty much embedded, and how do you go ahead and try to modify some of those patterns? And
I think also in communities where customary law kind of dictates the way natural resources are managed. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would say that those are many questions embedded in one. I mean, places where customary law dictates particularly rigid gender differences are not necessarily, in fact, often far from the case that those are indigenous or natural resource identified communities. So it's kind of like, I'll take the latter part of that and say, if you are dealing with communities where gender roles are very firm, are quite rigid, and are very firmly policed, either socially policed and or legislatively policed, as Lorena has pointed out, in fact, often environmental projects or environmental issues can be seen to be a neutral or relatively non-threatening way that can have larger social change effects and gender role effects. Yeah.
I think that also innovation, and I'll come back to the example that we were talking in Cameroon that also we have done in other parts of the world. This is, I mean, customary law was the one that really was preventing women to own the land. So we make an analysis of the chiefs. The chiefs were the ones that were holding that and guarding that custom and practice. And we just think, who talks to the chief? The wife and the mother. And we start working with the mothers and the wives of the chiefs to convince them to mobilize change. But we also need to think that we need to generate innovation in the way that we are working some of these elements. Sometimes is, as we talked before, introduction of a new area of work that has not been tagged like feminine or masculine that you can address. Sometimes it's walking around the things. For example, in Mexico, working with coastal marine projects, the taboos associated with women and fishing are tremendous, as in many other parts of the world. Women are not allowed to go out into the ocean. Women are not allowed to step into a boat if they have their period. Why? Because these have been socially norms to close something that it's open to anybody. I mean, nobody owns the ocean, a title to the ocean. So it's an open good, let's say like that. So socially, they have been a set of norms and restrictions. So working in this community, we said, okay, they cannot go out, very clear. They cannot go fishing, very clear. But how about if they own the boats? Because most of the men are renting the boats out. They don't own the boats. So how about if we provide enough resources for these women groups to own the boats and then they rent them to the fishermen, literally, and take into account a better rate when the capture is lower during different seasons. And we went around the cultural construction and provide something that was not culturally disruptive, but completely disrupted at the same time. But we didn't clash from the beginning. And that is how you need to create innovation to address these, because they have been so well socially constructed that if you try to go in, you will hit against the wall if this is one of the first things that you do. But if you come in with things that will surprise them, or really, I think that's the way forward in a lot of the work that we do. And this is how we have seen developing happening, and structural changes that have maintained, in the case, in some areas that I have worked, for 30 years. And then the new generations completely born with these new structural changes. And that's how you modify the culture.
I see. Thank you. I suppose, yes, times of crisis help to push boundaries where we thought that there was no flexibility before, right? So just one more question, and that, and if you could integrate your final comments with that as well, so we can wrap the event. I couldn't say it any better. I don't know. Anyway, do you believe that ecofeminism and pushing for smart and agricultural methods can lead to massive or substantial benefits for people in the global south?
I guess I'll start. Yes, in a nutshell, I would say yes. I mean, that's a really big question and one that we would have to disentangle into different parts. But overall, yes. I guess my concluding comments, which I would tag onto that question, are that, gender analysis is not some magic wand. It's not going to, suddenly change the world and make everything better and restore environmental sanity. But it's an important tool in our toolkit. And climate change is such a massive existential threat to the well-being of the planet and everything on it, or to everything on the planet, not the planet itself, that we can't afford to leave tools in our toolkit behind. And so my argument when I'm part of governmental, intergovernmental, international efforts or local efforts is to say, look, gender analysis is going to shed light on things that other analyses don't. It's going to provide information, it's going to provide opportunities, it's going to provide different venues, and we cannot afford to ignore that. So that would be my concluding pitch.
Mm-hmm. Lorena, please, if you wanna go.
Yeah, I will have to say that no amount of human planning, preparedness, or scientific investigation is going to be able to completely prevent climate change. We're going to continue seeing the effects through the droughts, the hurricane, and the floods occurring at random and beyond. Yet there is something that we have in our hands, and it's preventing social catastrophes as well, and most certainly lies within our collective human capacity. So by upholding gender equality and women rights specifically, we are in fact making one of the most crucial preparations associated to climate change that any society can make.
Thank you so much to end on this very optimistic and very empowering statement. Suppose we or people behind before us create a situation that we have to deal with, and we all have to deal with it together. So thank you so much for contributing to this very, very interesting and insightful conversation. And I hope that our members also benefited from this event. Before I greet you all, I would like to tell you about what we're going to have on Monday, and that's going to be another event on climate, very surprisingly. So it's going to be on conflict and climate change. So does climate change lead to conflict? So we'll be joined by Professor Halvard Buhaug from the PRIO, so the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and Dr. Marcus King from the Center for Climate and Security. So Monday, 7 p.m. I hope that you will come and join us again. So thank you so much. I'll now stop the live stream.